Welcome to Rehash, a Web3 podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Rehash, a Web3 podcast. I'm your host, Diana Chen, and in this episode, we are talking all about public goods, quadratic funding, community building, and so much more with Scott Moore, co-founder of Gitcoin. Welcome, Scott. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So for anybody who doesn't know you, which is probably few and far between, could you give a little introduction of yourself and tell people what your background is and what you were doing before you got into Web3?
Yeah, so I started in crypto way back at this point. I feel like I'm definitely an old person in crypto. I think there was at one point a survey on Twitter that's like, how many people are like over 30? Spoiler, I'm over 30. In my undergrad, I did political science and math with the idea of kind of thinking about political systems and economic systems and just voting actually generally. And I realized there wasn't really like a career in that. I decided ultimately I should just like go and do something in finance, which had a stable sort of like pay and stable sort of like career outcome. And ultimately what I realized was it kind of sucked. I think that's a common thread with a lot of people that came to crypto is they started somewhere in sort of like that world. And as like Le Guin might say, like when you talk about finance, you learn about like economics, like there's kind of like this feeling of listening to like a long and stupid dream that someone's like thought about for like maybe 5 minutes. And I think that we're sort of in this process now of rebuilding the financial system. And in 2016, when I sort of joined the space, everyone was kind of just barely starting to scratch the surface of what those changes to the system might be. And to me, that just felt really invigorating. In Toronto, where I'm from, like all the meetups were just people kind of thinking about like, hey, this thing is really broken. What if we just built it this way with these smart contracts and so forth? Now, obviously, those things did not really work out quite as intended. I actually worked on a project in 2016 called Venture Equity Exchange, which ultimately failed actually just before the DAO hack. The DAO hack was like really at a time where like the market was kind of in turmoil and no one wanted to talk about sort of anything related to at the time, we were trying to swap equity between founders and kind of create these founder collectives. And at that point, no one really wanted to talk about that for obvious reasons. But that sort of story of the traditional economic model, to me, just never really made any sense. It's actually why I studied political science and math, because originally I was doing economics and math. And I guess ultimately, that's what led me to Gitcoin, was just continuing to iterate on these experiments. And then eventually just joining Kevin after actually working on a very similar project and just deciding, you know what, we should just be working on this together. We shouldn't be competing. We should be collaborating. It is actually all coordination towards that. And I think that was just the history up to where people, I think, are much more familiar, which is Gitcoin as it was in 2017 all the way through where it is today.
Yeah, so Gitcoin is so many things, but I think for a lot of people, when they think of Gitcoin, they think of it as this thing that funds public goods. And public goods is a term that is thrown around a lot. I think I've actually asked other guests on the podcast, what is a public good? I've asked my friends in person, how do you define a public good? And I've gotten just like the broadest array of answers, anything from the most I guess, scientific or economic answer that it's a non-excludable and non-rivalrous thing to people saying, well, public good is just anything public that people define as good. Anything that people say is good is a public good. So when you talk about public goods, how do you define that?
Yeah, the funny thing is like neither of those answers is necessarily wrong. Like my view of public goods, I think originally did come from a similar sort of non-excludable, non-rivalrous definition, like the kind of Mankey, like Samuelson definition, which is Samuelson is kind of like widely regarded as originating that overall sort of idea. And non-excludability is the idea that like you can't stop someone from accessing a good. Non-rivalry is the idea that you can't compete for the good. There's so much of it; it's so abundant that it's just accessible for anyone's purpose. So like clean air is generally thought in this context to be a public good. The problem with this definition is that like you really only have public goods at like a certain scale in a certain local context. So a road or a bridge is not really truly a public good for like everyone, because you can't access a country or you can't access a road, or if you can't drive for various reasons, you're probably not really going to consider that for your purpose a public good, even though it might be a kind of good in your local community. Similarly with the internet, like not everyone can access the internet. The internet has, barriers in terms of fees that are associated with it, in terms of access in certain areas. Those are things that create a kind of like distinction that to me makes most of these things we call public goods more so like common goods. But the problem with the original definition, and this I think was actually partly intentional by like the way, especially Mankey's sort of like structured this idea. Basically, public good is thought to be this lofty thing that can't exist, and therefore private goods have to be the solution. You have to have private enterprises, you have to have private like sort of organizations solving these problems for the broader sort of like public. And what Ostrom kind of I think figured out is that actually common goods and common pool of resources, as she sort of like mostly referred to them, are not actually that dissimilar from public goods. It's not that bad a framing to talk about these things as quite similar in the way that you might think. Because, for example, forestry or fisheries, like these are things that we might consider common pool resources. And obviously, there's problems with people overfishing, there's problems with over deforestation and so forth. Those problems tend to be problems of how the resources are actually maintained. And it turns out with Ostrom's sort of principles, which are a lot to get into here, but like you can actually make it so that most of these types of common pool resources are sustainable. So, a road can avoid congestion, or the internet can avoid fees if they're managed properly. And it's basically a matter of thinking through in that context, what goods do we want to see in the world that are actually producing positive externalities for people in a local community at scale? Like basically, like how can you basically have the same good across many local communities producing positive externalities? And if you think of it that way, I actually think basically lots of these things make a lot more sense than in the non-excludable, non-rival risk definition. So that's a lot to get into, but like to me, the real definition is a public good in the sense that we want it to mean, I think, in Web3, and that it probably should mean more often in Web2, is any good that produces large scale positive externalities for many local communities.
Gotcha. I love that framing of it. And I think that's the first time I've heard that framing. And I like how you broke that down too, with there is this middle ground between public and private goods that you call common goods. I think a lot of people lump that into public goods, or they have the potential to produce the same positive externalities that public goods in its purest form produce. So I'm wondering, like, from your perspective, how do you see this applying to the open web? Because that's really the area where Gitcoin plays the most.
Yeah. So one thing that I should probably clarify as well, which is in that definition, and I should credit Galbraith for like kind of thinking about this framing more so in historical context. But like beyond something producing positive externalities, one of the big differences between something that would be a private sort of like market, good, and a common pool resource or a common good is whether the good actually has, like market support, or if there's like any kind of market failure. So like open source software and goods in the open web are like a prime example of something that have massive positive externalities. In fact, they're one of the unique types of goods in that they're fundamentally generative. So public goods, typically like in the context we're talking about, also tend to degrade because of this framework we've just built right now. That tends to be one of the concerns as well. How are you actually like ensuring these things continue to like grow and sustain themselves over time? You don't really have the same problem with open source software in the traditional sense. So what I mean by that is when you produce or build more open source software, even though the maintainer's time is finite, the actual use of that software tends to beget more use of that software and actually provides like building blocks that then beget more and more public goods in the form of more and more open source software. So you actually have this kind of generative effect that's kind of unique in that context, at least as far as I've seen. And so from my perspective, like you have this really interesting problem of there's probably hundreds of billions of dollars at this point of economic value generated by open source software. But at the same time, you have this massive, kind of market failure where no one is actually valuing that, despite the positive externalities it's producing. So to me, we're really talking about what is the future we're trying to achieve with all this like tooling that we're building. Well, we should be aiming for more abundance. We should be aiming for like better, more efficient systems, more resilient systems. That's what like, Web3 arguably is all about. And I think that if we start to like kind of look at like what's actually powering all that, it is just these fundamental building blocks that exist in Web2 and have been for so many years just totally underfunded. There's a great comic that talks about like the entire internet architecture, like infrastructure stack that you're using. and then just like the one random person in Nebraska that's like maintaining it and like keeping all of it afloat. And I think that's true in Web3 as well to some extent. But to me, beyond maybe the climate, which we'll probably get to, that's probably one of the goods that is the most global. And despite that global impact at all these different, local levels with all these different local repos for all these different local communities, you have so little funding that's actually being allocated to it. And so I think that's just crazy on one hand. And in the context of this sort of positive externalities world, it doesn't actually make economic sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And hearing you say that reminds me of this refi regen movement that has really been coming to the forefront recently. Why do you think there's been so much talk about refi, regen, public goods lately? And then how do you see refi and regen, maybe define it too for people who aren't familiar, fitting in with like public goods more broadly?
I think that refi and regen finance generally is is about creating kind of more sustainable systems in the context of mostly the climate. It's mostly talking about sort of like what are we, actually building everything on? Well, we're building it in a world that like has a climate that like if it ceases to exist, kind of creates some existential problems for us. And I think that really it's kind of creating incentive mechanisms that otherwise wouldn't exist for markets to be created that then help with that process. So like some of these have done better than others, but like one that has had some challenges has been, for example, like let's say like ClimaDAO. But like ClimaDAO's original intent, I think, was quite good, which was let's create an incentive for people to basically do kind of degen and yield farming activities that then end up providing long-term sustainable funding for basically like a carbon credits market, therefore sort of like sustaining climate over time. And I think those sorts of mechanisms are to me super interesting because you have this problem in Web3 where we do tend to, even in open source software, we tend to really think about like Web3 open source software libraries that we use that like kind of power, Ethereum, and these are valuable things. But we don't really think beyond that. We don't think to like Web2 open source software that we all use in pretty much any of those projects. And we especially, I think, don't tend to think about like the climate. So like this is something that Vitalik has talked a lot about recently, where it's like, what are all these sorts of like non-financial use cases trying to get us to, well, we're really trying to get to like use cases that actually have impact in the physical world and that like hopefully produce this sort of like better global coordination for the next 100, hopefully even 1,000 years, let's say. I mean, that's a very long time frame to work off of. But I think that ultimately the problem is that like we just haven't thought that far. And regen, refi, they're memes, right? They're just kind of like ways of thinking about these problems and kind of a way that produces like a strong sort of narrative force, sort of like solar punk does in my opinion. But these memes and these narratives are super powerful because they produce actual like physical real world results that kind of help sustain some of these things we would otherwise just forget about. So I mean, from my perspective, we've definitely neglected some degree of open source software. I think Web3 is much better at that than Web2. And we've also, I think even in Web3 to some extent, perhaps not as much in the last maybe 6 months to a year, neglected these other substrates like the climate that we rely on. So they're kind of, distinct movements in the sense that, in Web2, the open source software community does not talk to like the climate activist community. They're not like related. They don't like interconnect. But I think that what we're realizing is that actually all these things are interconnected in ways that we just like didn't think about for the last like probably several hundred years. And certainly that like I think especially in the last 50 years as sort of other societal structures and substrates have degraded, we've started to like really be less and less motivated to connect.
It seems like, at least from what I've observed, that a lot of people who are deep into Web3 and even people who are deep into Web2 tech, just the tech space in general, almost live in this alternate reality that's separate from what's actually happening in our physical world. And climate, I think, is a big thing that we can forget about when our face is in the screen all day and we're sitting in our basement coding or playing games on our computer or whatever. It's easy to forget what's going on outside. But really, like, without climate and without taking care of our physical world, then, we won't be able to sit in our basements and code or play games or do the things that we want to do. So they are super important. And one thing I love about this refi regen movement is that it's very multidisciplinary. Like, we're taking note of issues that are happening across the board, not just within this very narrow scope of Web3 or blockchain or crypto, but that's happening in our world. And something that I wanted to ask you too is, like, how do you think about the obligations or the duties that we owe to each other as people who are building in Web3 as it relates to public goods like the climate?
Yeah, I think that's actually, like, to me, the fundamental question. Like, I think over the last, like, 200 years, longer than that, but, like, we've had all these institutions that we've relied on for these things. We've had, like, governments, we've had companies, we've had structures that we've actually gotten, like, really used to. Like, we don't even see them as, like, choices we've made. We see them just as, like, defaults that, like, are in the world that, like, we can't change. And I think that what we've realized is actually most of those institutions are not doing a particularly good job at the things that they were supposed to accomplish. So in the case of climate, we've had, like, 26 years of these climate summits with the UN, and none of those have really produced, like, meaningful action, at least to the point where we're actually, the UN recently released a report where they're sort of saying, actually, we might be, like, even further past the point of no return than we thought. And to me, like, it's kind of, a funny situation when the UN is doing that after having 26 years of these summits, because it's kind of an admission of, like, well, yeah, like, we kind of tried to do this thing, it didn't really work. And so my view is not that those institutions should be totally dismantled. I think they have lots of important roles to play. I also think you can't, like, break down a system before you, like, fully understand why that system was put in place. I think often we have this problem with just, like, pretending, like, oh, if we just do everything from, like, first principles, we'll, like, solve it, and we don't need to worry about why they built it the way they built it. But I do think there's lots of improvements that could be made to those systems that, like, Web3 is starting to really touch on. And I think that what we're realizing is that it's just extremely slow to get anything of substance done in those existing institutions because there's so much historical baggage that's built up in them. And in that context, it is kind of useful to have another system that can be used as a kind of forcing function for the existing system to improve itself or to work faster on issues that are, like, kind of pressing in terms of timeline or in terms of their just scale of impact. In that view, I think Web3 is kind of a set of coordination tools that allows people to play these games with each other that produce incentives that end up leading to larger scale impact, both in the work that's being done itself, but also in terms of this second order effect of trying to go back and create change in institutions that otherwise wouldn't be possible. And so my view is basically that Web3 is not going to be the thing that solves, like, all of global coordination, but it will be something that basically is in this sort of partnership. And I think, yeah, some of the stuff we're doing on the Gitcoin side, I think it's super relevant to this. Like, quadratic funding to me is a great way to engage local communities in the problem of solving for their own shared needs without needing to have, like, all these other groups necessarily involved in that process. Yeah, there's a lot of nuance to this that, like, probably is, like, way too much of a rabbit hole to get into. But my view is that if we're kind of continuing to build these systems that fund public goods in ways that are totally novel or distinct from the mechanisms we used previously, and make no mistake, like, choosing to build, like, public goods and through a committee or through a government sort of, like, grants program. Those are things that are choices that have been made. Those are, like, mechanisms that are being implemented. It is the same sort of, like, structural thing as, like, producing a new smart contract that then, like, goes and deploys some amount of funding to, say, core developers, like, for example, Protocol Build is doing. And I think that if we have a, like, marketplace of these different ideas that's actually, like, working with these existing institutions, I just think it'll be a lot easier for everyone.
Yeah, no, that's great. And just to take a step back for anybody listening who isn't familiar with some of the things that maybe you brought up, quadratic funding is the funding framework that Gitcoin uses to fund their rounds, which there's an active round right now, Gitcoin round 14, which is focused on climate. Can you, for anyone who's not familiar, break down what quadratic funding is?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not the only way we've done this in Web3. Like, there's lots of mechanisms that are being designed that are basically towards this end of creating new ways to fund public goods beyond these sort of like institutions, or at least in new ways that institutions themselves could adopt as well, but just in distinct ways from what we've done before. And the way in which quadratic funding particularly does this is by taking kind of a signal from the community and using that in a way to democratically distribute basically a pool of matching funds from large philanthropists or from projects that care about a particular ecosystem or particular cause, basically to like a set of grantees that are just being on their own permissionlessly added to what's effectively a grants registry. So in short, basically, you have like a set of grants. You have a kind of 2 week period usually where we run these rounds. As you mentioned, GR14 is happening right now. And GR14, I think, has like 5,000 grantees or so. So it's a pretty large kind of pool. You have a period in which anyone can donate to those different grantees based on their own preferences. And then there's matching pools that are kind of structured so that any subset of these grantees that a matching funder wants to fund are given sort of access to another pool of capital. And sometimes these pools overlap. And then at the end of the round, basically you tally, the square of the sum of the square roots of contributions for a grantee. And then you basically use that calculation to decide how much the matching pool should be distributed. We have a little bit of a iteration on this mechanism. So, for example, we use pairwise matching versus regular quadratic matching. That's not something that we'll probably dive into in a lot of depth here. But or let's say you have like one grantee that gets two $4 donations and one grantee that gets eight $1 donations. The former would get a matching amount of $16. The latter would get a matching amount of $64. And you would basically, otherwise in a normal matching program, get the same amount. It's the same dollars being donated in each case. But in this case, we're actually looking at the signal that we're getting from each individual contributing a different sort of amount and signaling their own interest in the project. So basically, quadratic funding provides this additional sort of community sentiment analysis. And that sentiment basically is at the key of, I think, why this is better than just the traditional committee model. Like, yes, you lose some efficiency, but what you gain instead of efficiency is resilience. You gain resilience and you gain a sort of like democratic consistency. We often want to defer to technocratic solutions. We often want to avoid giving the public too much kind of decision making power because there's concerns with that approach. And I think that what we're realizing is actually most of the time you gain a lot from doing that. You lose some efficiency, but you gain a lot from giving the public direct control over what they want to see in the world. TLDR is basically that like one, it's the sort of like, democratic way to optimally fund public goods. Two, it's this sort of way of taking the square of the sum of the square roots of contributions and doing all this sort of math. And then three, mostly it's just like the sort of only way I've seen so far of making this trade-off, I think, relatively effectively between efficiency and resilience that like actually functionally is out in the world and being used, in the Web3 context.
It helps. And it sounds like quadratic funding optimizes more for the number of contributions you get than the amount of the contribution that you get. And so the sort of positive side is that you prevent whales from coming in and sort of like overfunding a project just from one person's conviction alone. But I guess just to play devil's advocate a little bit, doesn't the amount that somebody wants to fund also show their genuine conviction in the project? From your perspective, do you see any maybe unintended consequences of the quadratic funding model, or any areas with this that like you would want to improve if you could create an even more ideal model than quadratic funding?
Yeah, so actually, like on that first point, Vitalik does a really good job of outlining this in his post on quadratic payments, which is actually like even I think might have preceded his formal paper, which I didn't mention earlier, but the original conception of quadratic funding was made by Vitalik, Plan Whale, and Zoe Hitze, part of a paper that was originally given a very long title and I think was just shortened to like a flexible framework for like philanthropic giving. The idea basically of QF is not that you should totally disregard the amount that someone cares. If someone donates $10, it still is much less impactful than someone donating $1,000. But what you want to do is you want to dampen that amount so that people are given kind of relative weightings and not like kind of these large scale like absolute weightings such that like large donors totally drown out the small donors. Ultimately, I think that the goal and the reason that I think it was called sort of this optimal way of doing sort of democratic funding, the goal is to make sure that you have like that balance basically between preference and the individual donations, the one person, one vote idea, and the weighted preference that you get from like those donations. So, because the ultimate like flattening of this would just be you just say everyone gets one vote. That's it. Like, let's see what happens. And I think that that loses that signaling benefit that you're talking about, right? Ultimately, I think that there's probably ways to iterate on this that have actually been talked about in for example, the DSOC paper that Vitalik and Puja and others put out. Those are things we're planning to implement in the coming rounds. But I think that it does strike this really nice balance that otherwise I think would lead to probably a few challenges. One would be that like you're going to get less matching funders actually interested in donating because they don't see the skin in the game from individual donors. They don't see people like putting their preferences on the line. Two, you get this problem of like kind of as you mentioned, like people aren't given the option with one sort of like vote to really signal how much they care about different things. And then three, I think ultimately there's this kind of large scale second order effect that you get from this system, which is you learn basically what different local communities care about. And then you can actually like structure the rounds themselves in ways that start to like make it slightly more fair for different participants in different local contexts. So if you had like a massive global QF round for like everyone in the world, you'd run into this huge problem where like a billionaire who wants to donate $100 million to something is still probably going to like outweigh a lot of small donors who are donating $100 each. But if you make a round that's specific to, let's say, the community of Oakland and specifically like different kinds of public goods in that context, which Jesse Pollack and a few others are working on right now, you actually start to scope the problem and the sort of like space of public goods in a way that's like in context of a certain jurisdiction. So what you get on the one hand is like you're probably not going to have these massive whales that come in from like a totally different community that are like willing to put $100 million into like disrupting this one small round, but you still get the signaling that can be basically generated over time and kind of aggregated between all these different local rounds. So this kind of goes back to the common pool resource question, right? One of the principles that Ostrom really outlines is kind of just localism. Like, how do you actually focus on one individual community, set boundaries around it, and focus on their needs before you start to focus on like everyone's needs all around the world? And I think that in this context, what we're really looking at is essentially a kind of nesting of these different local communities and their preference maps. And then over time, finding ways to kind of like build up larger subsets or like kind of intersections of these communities that eventually lead to that global scale public good, like things like open source software, things like the climate, but do so incrementally with lots of local sort of like rounds and local groups instead of just all at once with one big pool. Question mark on whether or not that actually will solve that issue in the long run. But to me, that's ultimately where we are trying to go. And I think that's kind of like in line with this plural network goods, like DSOC kind of model that Vitalik's talked about.
Yeah, and another application of quadratic funding is to governance, like in DAOs. What do you think about quadratic voting as like a voting mechanism that DAOs should or should not adopt?
I definitely think that most DAOs should be considering things other than token weighted voting. That includes like Gitcoin. I haven't really been involved directly in those like discussions on how to like iterate on that or evolve that. I think one of the challenges with governance is mostly that we get really stuck on like models that we've seen. It's kind of the same problem as I talked about in like the context of like Web2 institutions, where like we see a model that works really well and we say, that's cool, we should just do that. And then we do that for a long time before we actually make any iterations or changes. In the context of governance, I think that's true of like the Uniswap, like Governor Alpha, Governor Bravo model. We kind of just said, this seems to work. Let's go and implement it. And there's good reasons for that too, because I mean, if you start randomly implementing like new governance approaches, you might just end up with more attack vectors that you didn't think about or like that just like didn't occur to you before. But at the same time, I think quadratic voting is pretty well tested and is like at this point, I think pretty well studied in Web3. And I don't think it would, be a bad thing for more DAOs to be implementing that, including on our side. I certainly think if it were up to me, which it's not, like I think we would want to be one of the first DAOs to actually implement that. So to me, yeah, like there's a trade-off between how fast you move and then like, how much risk you take. And I think we're probably doing a pretty good job of moving like with that balance in mind, not taking too much risk, but like moving relatively quickly. But I would love to see that in action.
What do you think that would actually look like in practice? Because we haven't really seen that, right? And like the closest thing that I can maybe think to that is sort of this like the DAO house model of they do use token gated weighting, but it's a little different because you can stake the tokens that you earn back into the DAO to increase your governance vote, or you could, liquidate them and turn them into fiat or whatever you want to like pay your bills, for instance. And so there's at least that choice of what you want to do with your tokens if you want more governance rights or if you just want the money. But other than that, I can't really think of a closer example that I've seen. Can you think of anything, or could you describe what that would hypothetically look like if a DAO decided to implement that?
To start, like, I mean, one, I think that's a really good model. Like, I do like those approaches. The DAO House team in general is, I think, being one of the most probably engaged on thinking through different mechanisms. So, like, I think from that perspective, like, they're a great example of a group that is like actively pushing boundaries on like different types of governance. I think that the way I would probably want to see something like that implemented would probably be simpler to start in the sense that like I really think a lot of groups could just straight up take like snapshot instances and just apply quadratic weightings and like voting to it. Some DAOs are already doing this like and iterating on like the way that snapshot voting works with like ranked choice voting, for example, which I think is also a really good model. But like ultimately, I would not necessarily encourage, partly from a UX perspective, and just like one thing that I think any Web3 organization runs into is like it's very hard to teach people new modes of like taking action. And it's very challenging sometimes to like suddenly, like if someone was to port over entirely like to DAO House, like, that would be just like a huge initiative on its own that would take like tons of time to actually play out. But I do think that like even those small changes, and experiments with existing systems that people are using, like Snapshot, would be like probably an easier path. And I would like to see a lot more sort of like experimentation on that front. Yeah, there must be examples. It's funny, like there must be examples that I'm missing that like have done this. I've just been like so like heads down, like focused in that like I probably am missing them. But if anyone knows them and like is in the comments when this is live, please post them because I would love to look at them.
Yes, I would love to know as well. So tweet them to myself or Scott or post them somewhere. I think one thing that I'm really excited about actually with the bear market is that I'm actually going to have time to keep up with the different things that are happening because I think in a bull run, it's just so hard to keep up with everything. What are some things that you think about more as we're now in a bear market? Things that we actually have time to focus on that you think are really important and that we should be spending more of our time and energy thinking about?
Honestly, like I don't want to say a bear market is good. I think that there's lots of challenges with being in a bear market. I do think we probably got way too ahead of ourselves in the previous market. And I think from that perspective, it's nice to have like a bit of calm. Like I think from just even like a mental health perspective or like a sustainability perspective, the previous run was kind of crazy. And I think a lot of people were aware of that. I think a lot of people were like talking about that actively. probably including myself to some extent, like when the market was in that position. My view is that like it kind of goes back to like what we talked about with the sort of like Vitalik, like focus on the physical world, focus on impact conversations. Because to me, like what we're sort of missing is like a lot of use cases that actually bring tangible value to like real problems that like broader society, just like beyond Web3 is facing. And I do think that the bear market gives us an opportunity to kind of focus back in on those things and focus back in on like the like core things, the core like infrastructure that we need to get there. And one thing that even I do think to some degree lost track of, and like we are focusing on, for example, like Planet in this current round, but we're also focusing on like Ethereum core infrastructure. So like we actually reintroduced a round specifically for Ethereum core research and development that kind of got lost in some of the like DAO votes. I think in previous iterations in around 12, around 13, it kind of like I think started to see less funding and less interest. And I do think going back to those roots is going to be really important as we head to like the bear market to think about like, okay, what are the things that we can build now so that in like a year or 2 years time, we actually have like sustainable new kind of infrastructure that we can work with. So like in the last bear market, people probably don't remember this, but like, Wallet Connect was just starting. It was just like an idea. And now, of course, it's powering things like Rainbow Wallet and like all these like tools that people probably aren't even like really familiar with, or aware of it powering. We also things like co-op, which like everyone is like super excited about now and like everyone is like constantly using. So I'm really curious to see what the next iterations or like versions of those pieces of infrastructure look like in the next like 12 to 24 months. But then, yeah, I mean, like, I would love to figure out like how we can be more intentional with the way that we build these systems. I think one thing we almost sort of saw in this last run, which like could have been a bad outcome, was like, Facebook jumping in, starting like, I mean, Meta now jumping in and talking about like their new ideas for Web3 and for what we could be building here. There's probably for every one of these things, there's always some kernel of like real value that's like been generated to be sure. But like in a lot of those cases, I think we could easily be on a runway course to like basically just repeat the same mistakes as in Web2. And I think that like, we have to ask ourselves, like, are we trying to build like these systems that are powering trillions of dollars of value, like in one sort of like central DAO? Are we trying to build systems that are like, scaling on their own, like in a centralized fashion to building people? Like, I think most people probably watching this would agree that the answer is no. Like, we're trying to build lots of small modular tools that then like are useful in these different contexts for like different, again, kind of can keep going back to this point with local communities. So from that perspective, I think on the one hand, we're like doing a better job, I think, even in the bear market of like focusing more on like the real world use cases, less speculative use cases. On the other hand, we're starting to focus back on infrastructure, which hopefully will lead to like another wave of like things that we kind of have to some degree taken for granted in the bull market as things that just like exist and will like keep powering the next wave of systems that we want to use. And then three, I think it's like kind of a philosophical question of like, what are the values that we want to see in Web3 and like how can we better articulate those both to ourselves and then also to basically the broader sort of like ecosystem, including to like a lot of these larger players that are probably not in the context of a bear market as interested in making this a priority as they might have been before. So to some degree, I think that buys us time. I think it buys us a lot of like new perspective. And I think it gives me personally a lot of hope, actually, which is a weird thing to say in the context of like, I recognize that it is a challenging time and like that, like we also shouldn't, make light of like the fact that it's like going to be a challenging time to go through. But I do think there's time for reflection. There's time for kind of like reevaluation. And that's to me like the really important piece of all this.
Yeah, one last thought for you, Scott, and then we'll wrap it up here. But when I think about the real life implications of Web3 and what we're building here, I think one thing that makes me kind of nervous sometimes is just how divided we've all become in the US and Canada, less so probably, but it's still there. And in the world more generally, like it seems like if you're on crypto Twitter at all, like everyone likes to fight about everything, and we can take like the smallest, like the most harmless tweet and politicize it, or misinterpret it in a way that we use to attack other people. I'm wondering, like, what do you think we need to do, especially during this bear market, while, like you said, we kind of have a chance to reset and rebuild and set ourselves back on the right course? What are some things that you think we all need to do individually to build up a better environment and a better community for all of us to exist in through the next bull run, for instance, whenever we reach that, and to create a better place for all of us to want to be and not feel ostracized, not feel like we could be attacked at any second? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a deep last question, actually. Um, on the one hand, like, I don't think cynicism is ever like a neutral position, and I think that we've gotten to a point where we've started to think about cynicism as like a good default. I think it's very easy to switch from, hey, we're trying to like solve these problems and like let's like be mindful and critical and like approach these things carefully. It's to like actually like we're just going to be like massively cynical and like this was kind of something Vitalik talked about in the context of Cory Doctorow signing off on the recent sort of like anti crypto letter that was signed in the U.S. And like I think that to me is a good example of unnecessary infighting starting to happen within communities that should really be working together towards like this kind of again like reimagining of existing institutions and like kind of like path towards forcing existing institutions to like reimagine or reconsider their own perspectives. One thing that would be important is just like not falling prey to cynicism and being aware of basically taking everything in good faith when we have these like sort of discussions and as we're building new tools, making the assumption that like most people, unless there's lots of track record to kind of provide evidence otherwise, which I think gives me some like weight in the context of the Meta Facebook conversation. I think it's important to like just in most cases keep that in mind. And then I think in addition, it's just a matter of like thinking about what our own shared needs are in our local communities and solving problems in our local communities first. And then if we do that effectively, having this sort of expectation and the hope that that will create like room for these nested types of different, global public goods to eventually find funding and find solutions. So that kind of goes back to the approach we're taking with these different QF rounds. Beyond that, I think it's probably a time for a lot of people to double down on community and like building relationships generally. I think it's very easy for people to get caught up in the idea that like we can just solve these problems in a vacuum and that we like don't have to work together. We live in this kind of post-truth world where we have like a lot of people like providing competing narratives that don't have like a lot of like structured evidence like backing them up. In that context, it's very easy to get lost. It's very easy to stop focusing on building community. Really, like with the solar pump narrative, for example, that we've really been pushing for on the Gitcoin side, like what we've been trying to do is mostly produce like an optimistic take on the way technology and the environment can like work in tandem rather than kind of thinking about this cyberpunk dystopia that I think has actually become like a massive part of our like modern culture and like media. And I think that when we think of it that way, when we think of like the futures we're trying to build, like we need to think of basically our media and like the narratives we consume and the way we like take on relationships with each other as gateways to the future that we'll eventually end up in. And I think that like with Solarpunk, I hope that that leads us in a slightly better direction and gives us more optimism and gives us more sort of room for those sorts of collaborations. But in general, I also would love to just see more people like build those narratives that have that optimism, that have that kind of vision for the future, and that do that without falling into, I guess, like that kind of cynicism. The last thing maybe I'll mention is that like kernel community, like Vivek and Andy have done an amazing job there. I think also does a really great job of providing like principles that like are honestly far more relevant than like anything that I could say here. And I would definitely highly recommend people go and check those principles out. And the syllabus is all like free online and kind of fits into this solar punk vision as well. So yeah, that's a good question. It's a really good question.
Yeah, sorry to end on such a big and kind of heavy note, but I also want to shout out Kernel. As somebody who's gone through the Kernel program myself in the past, I absolutely recommend it to everybody. And if you don't have time to go through it or don't get chosen or whatever, you should still look at the modules online. Like Scott said, they're all open to anybody to see. So thanks, Scott. I know we're at time, but I like to finish every podcast episode with a quick little game. If you have another minute or two.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so the game is called This or That. I just give you 2 words, A or B, and you tell me which one you prefer. It's really quick, lightning round. You don't have to explain yourself or anything. And I've got 10 pairs of words for you. So are you ready to go?
Oh yes. I will try my best not to add any context or like caveats, which you'll note is a common theme. But let's go.
We had Catherine Wu from Archetype. I don't know if you know her on the podcast, and she struggled more than anyone on this game. So, so she set the bar pretty low for future guests. So I think you'll be okay. Hopefully, we'll see. The first one I've got is Bitcoin or Ethereum.
Ethereum.
Crypto or Web3.
Hesitantly Web3.
Okay. DAOs or NFTs.
Yes.
Bear market or bull market.
Hesitantly bear market.
Building or investing.
Building.
Books or podcasts.
Books, actually, though. Sorry.
That's okay.
I mean,
You're
I
allowed
love
to say that.
podcasts too, but
Hey,
I mean, books though. Books are you can't miss books.
No worries at all. Next one, poutine or beaver tails?
Routine. That's a good one.
Past or future?
Future.
Dogs or cats?
That's a tough one too, but dogs.
Okay, and then last one, Earth or space?
That's a really that is actually because there's a lot to unpack in that. But I would say, I mean, Earth. I one thing on that one, I think that we often make this weird trade-off where we're like, we shouldn't be focusing on space because we need to protect, the Earth, which is true. But also, like, there's a certain optimism that comes from like exploration and like having, where I'm going with this. I don't need to continue, but I think that that's a really interesting one. Just like as we go into like that conversation about solar punk and optimism. So.
Yeah, maybe
Awesome.
for our next podcast episode together, we'll just dive into that for an hour.
That sounds amazing.
All right, last thing, Scott, before you go, where can people find you if they want to follow you or connect with you? And where can people go to learn more about Gitcoin, maybe apply for a grant, apply for Kernel? Feel free to plug away.
I would say if you are looking to fund public goods, go to gitcoin.co/grants. If you're looking to create your own grant for any of the rounds coming up, just add /new. It's the easiest thing to do. If you want to learn more about just what we're up to on the DAO side, gov.gitcoin.co is our governance forum, and there's a lot going on there that you can dive into. And then for me personally, my Twitter is just not Scott Moore. Awaki is just Awaki. And ultimately, beyond that, I mean, if you're on our Discord, Gitcoin's Discord, anywhere like that, just feel free to reach out. We're always around and always down to answer questions about public goods.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And we'll be back again soon with another episode of Rehash.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Rehash, a Web3 podcast. The guest from this episode, Scott Moore, was nominated by Diana Chen and voted onto the podcast by Tim, Zaku, Dame, Julia, Triumph, Saji, and Diana. Some of the questions you heard were submitted by Karsten. Rehash is hosted by Diana Chen, produced and edited by Ellie Dots and Tyler Internet, and as always, supported by Rehash DAO. To stay up to date on all things Rehash, you can follow us on Twitter at RehashWeb3 and join our Discord to get involved.